Hey guys, finally our last section of the plant notes. And then finally next semester we get to talk about fun stuff like genetics and evolution. But we'll have to get through this. So it starts by talking about some basic defenses plants have. First, structural defenses. Sharp edges, thorns, spines, trichomes, the hairs on the leaves that we've talked about. Physical barriers like bark, or just in general, the impenetrable outer coats, or even the waxy cuticle called cutin that we mentioned before. All of those are going to be defense mechanisms. The defenses don't have to just be physical or structural, though. Some defenses are chemical. So if even in hot peppers, they have the capsicum or capsaicin, or in mustard oils, there's a chemical in mustard oils that is toxic to many insects. So the second those insects try to eat them, they obviously don't like it and then don't go back for more. Some trichomes are even modified to release chemicals when touched, and that will also repel insects. So this, every time I've used these old notes from another teacher, I've read the capsicum. I was like, I thought it was capsaicin. So, but there is a capsaicin and a capsicum. I don't know if they're just two different chemicals produced by peppers, but either one is a good example. There is a way to attract beneficial predators. It's kind of interesting. There's an insect that will chew on a plant and that will release a chemical that will attract parasitoid wasps. And then the wasp will lay its eggs on insects, or in insects rather. Those will hatch and the larvae will feed on the insects. So basically, I feel like this doesn't explain it too well, but basically you have this insect that feeds on the plant, harming the plant, and the parasitoid wasp will lay its eggs inside the insect, and then eventually the insect will be completely overtaken by these hatching parasitoid wasps. So I've shown all my classes that video of the parasitoid wasp, so hopefully you guys have seen that before. If not, maybe you can show it, just find it on YouTube right now and watch that awesome video of the insects coming out of or the wasps coming out of the insect. It's so gross. But that's helpful because those insects would have otherwise been eating the plant and now they're dead. Just a very dramatic way of killing them, I guess. So this shows that plants can communicate with other organisms via their chemicals. So anytime we talk about communication, it's usually going to go back to a chemical being released. So sometimes they might ask you, how does a plant communicate with other organisms? And you might think, well, they don't communicate. And you can go back to this example of they release a chemical and that attracts something. In this case, it's the parasitoid wasp, but anytime you have a chemical being released and something responding, that's, in the biology world, is communication. So, and hopefully by producing those chemicals, a mutualistic relationship can develop. A long-term relationship where both organisms can benefit. So I told you plant communication goes back to just releasing chemicals. Something responds to those chemicals. And the cells of a single plant can communicate to each other through those connections between the cells. If you remember, those connections are called plasmodesmata in plants. Those are just connections that allow molecules, hormones to move from cell to cell. So plants have non-specific immune defense systems. If you've taken any anatomy, any physiology, you've heard this before. Hopefully you've heard it anyway, but they honestly don't include this and the content for just normal biology. So non-specific defense, so we have both non-specific and specific immunity. Non-specific are things that will generally repel any pathogen, or in plants' case, pathogen or predator. So something in general for humans that will just repel, or rather protect us from pathogens, includes skin, mucus of various orifices, and temperature. So that's always an interesting one, because temperature is a good thing. You have a temperature because your body's trying to kill something, but then it can get out of control. It starts to kill things that are good as well, so that's why we try to control our temperature as well. We don't want it to get too high. Specific immunity, though, is interesting because it goes after a specific pathogen. So your body actually remembers what has attacked it before and then tries to attack it again. So the main difference is that this is a general protection. This one is specific towards things. I always hate explaining this because I use the term in my definition, but it is specific for something that is attacking you. So an example of that are antibodies. And if you don't know anything about antibodies, then that is going to sound a little vague right now, and that's okay, because you're not going to be asked too much about the specific immunity, because we're not going to go too much in depth in it right now. You will probably be asked about non-specific. But antibodies, you have antibodies that will recognize pathogens, and the second you get a pathogen that attaches to one of those antibodies, your body makes much more of them, so that the second you get that same pathogen, it attacks it with force. So not just general towards anything, it's a very specific attack to something that's already attacked you. T cells and cytokines are other ways that we can specifically attack something with more force. And again, we'll get into those things in the anatomy and physiology unit. I just want you to have heard them at least once before we do that. So non-specific immune defense systems for plants. No, like I don't. They'll ask you about this on the test, and I mean, it's pretty obvious what examples are for plants, so I think you guys would get it anyway. But any of these up here are non-specific because they're just going to act in general against many predators, non-specific. But an example explained a little more in detail, I guess, is that there are chemicals in insect saliva that cause the plant to produce chemicals that can repel harmful insects or attract beneficial predators. And that goes back to what we were talking about up here. So again, the organization of these notes sometimes drives me a little crazy, but there is a specific name for that you might, I guess, need to know, and that's wound response. So and what's interesting is sometimes a plant can release a chemical, and if that another plant near it senses it, then it will also start producing that chemical as well. So if that's a chemical that will repel a certain insect, then another plant can start doing that as well, which is really weird. It does mention the cutin and trichomes here for non-specific defense that we mentioned here as well. So there you go. But remember, things like bark can go under that as well. So hypersensitive response is an interesting thing that happens in plants that you're going to have to know about. Essentially what happens is a pathogen infects a plant, and that initiates a signal transduction pathway which will activate the gene, which will produce a certain signal or hormone that's released that will actually start killing the leaf. And so it's almost like, hey, I'm infected, like I'm gonna kill this part of myself because it's infected. Not only that, but the signal can go to another area, and certain antimicrobial substances can be produced that will give that plant acquired resistance to whatever is infecting it. So it's crazy that plants have that capability. But here are the basic steps. So the pathogen will attach to a receptor in a cell on the leaf. That could be a certain fungus that infects the plant, a bacteria, a virus. I feel like there's one other one, but those are the main ones they always talk about infecting plants. That's going to initiate that signal transduction pathway, which will activate a gene that will make some sort of chemical that will cause the cells to seal off the pathogens and start to die. So remember, apoptosis is just cell suicide. And those dying cells will release a chemical signal that will go to other parts of the plant. Then, of course, you still have to have that signal transduction pathway initiated there. And in the end, resistance is achieved when antimicrobial substances are made in those remote areas. So kind of fascinating. I don't absolutely love plants, but it's kind of crazy what they can do sometimes. In general, temperature is going to affect flowering, like we've talked about. Sorry, this paused again and it annoys me so much. But anytime you increase the temperature, remember, increasing temperature means things, chemicals are moving around more, molecules are moving around more, so they're probably going to be released more. So increasing temperature usually means chemicals are released more. And that can happen a lot when plants are flowering, which makes sense because that's going to attract pollinators. Well, obviously if it's a good chemical, but that does happen. So temperatures rise and certain chemicals will be released to attract pollinators. Another example of communication between plants and animals. Real quick, just throwing this out there, one reason why plants don't always do this is because it's really, it's very energy costly. So the plant doesn't want to constantly be producing a substance that costs a lot of energy. So it only does it when absolutely necessary. Kind of goes back to flowering. Plants don't flower all the time because it costs a lot of energy. The amount of light plants receive affects whether they're going to flower or not. And there are two types of plants. There are short day plants and long day plants. And it's exactly what it sounds like. Short day plants want a lot, well, I don't know about a lot of darkness, but they want a certain amount of darkness. They want short days. Long day plants want more sun. They want long days, and then they will flower. So they've taken a couple plants and they did an experiment where here you can see the normal situation where these plants get a short day. The length of night is fairly long, day is fairly short. Short day plant, and it flowered. They put it under artificial scenario where they had a short night and they had a long day. And did it flower? No. Then they did an interesting experiment where they gave it the normal situation. They gave it what it wanted, a short day, long night, but then they had a flash of light and it didn't flower. So even interrupting it just a little bit with the light and it won't flower still. Same thing, opposite concept. Long day is wanted, and you might not be able to see it very well, but this is actually flowering. They're like little white flowers because they're clovers. So this is flowering. So long day, that's what it wants, flowers. Short day, doesn't like that, no flowers. Short day, but then it gets a flash of light and it will still flower. So they will ask you questions about this. They'll say, what if a short day plant gets a short day but has a flash of light? And then it'll ask you what happens. Does it flower or not? I hope I didn't say any of that backwards. This seriously might be my last day here, and I feel like I'm ready to go at any minute to have this baby. So, yeah, it's a struggle. If you have any questions about this, there's so much. I mean, it's really simple, but it's in your textbook, and it has these exact pictures, I do believe. And it's really easy, but so I told you a second ago that plants want to conserve their energy, and so reproduction is only going to happen when they have reserve energy beyond what they just normally use for maintenance and growth. Plants do not reproduce when energy is in short supply. So there's different things that affect flowering. We saw how the day length did. We know that temperature does. Well, we're going to talk about it here in a second too. But also water availability. So we want ideal conditions to flower. And some plants flower after a cold period called vernalization. The environment alters transcription factors to either silence or express genes. So all of those things will alter gene expression. So vernalization in general, stimulates flowering by exposure to cold treatments. So it's kind of interesting. It's like the plant knows to expect winter. So if it just stays warm, they've done experiments and those plants actually they stop flowering because it's like they're expecting cold to happen. And so if you have a flower in an artificial environment that doesn't get that cold, then it's like it's waiting for that cold to happen to ensure that surely the temperature is going to get better, day length is going to get better, water availability is going to get better because it's spring. So it needs that cold shock to be like, hey, winter happened, now we can flower. And if you don't give it that, then they won't flower. Here's another one of those diagrams they might show you where you can see these molecules. In this case, these represent genes, but you don't really need to know if it's representing a gene or a molecule. You just have to be able to read it. So in this case, you can see several things. We can see that the the FLC gene stops or prevents flowering because it's stopping these two genes that cause flowering. Sure, we have a middleman in here, but eventually this causes flowering. And FLC has that stop line. If you saw this picture and it said what promotes flowering, there are two genes you could, well, actually 4 total, but you could say either one of these promote flowering, you could say either one of these promote flowering. You could even say gibberellic acid promotes flowering, light in the circadian clock. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. You're really just reading the lines and looking down. Okay, this stops this. So what if I were to stop this? Well, I'm stopping an inhibitor. So that actually would promote flowering. So they'll probably just ask you really easy things based on a picture and name one thing that's activating or one thing that's stopping the process, whatever process they're talking about. Plants actually can reproduce sexually or asexually, depending on the plant. Some can do both. Some can only do asexual reproduction, but most can do sexual reproduction. Meiosis increases variation by crossing over. So we never talk about that because we never talk about plants in regular biology. It's not in the curriculum or in the state guidelines. But crossing over actually does happen in plant seeds and plants' DNA. So you usually don't see too much variation in plants in reproduction, but it's there. And that's why you can that's why you can do artificial selection with plants. You can choose the best ones out of a whole group because there is variation. And then you can only choose the largest tomatoes to breed. So this goes back to our previous conversation, but plants do utilize dormancy in order to build up their energy. They wait until everything is right in order to finally germinate, that initial growth, and then grow. It's mostly triggered by water and temperature, which kind of makes sense, at least to me. But we can go back to that day length. It does get triggered by day length as well. That cold spurt, that vernalization, and then this one, some seeds have to soak up water. Every year I tell myself to get rid of that one because I feel like that's, yeah, okay, duh. Symbiosis, I don't know if you guys remember that vocab word, but it's a long-lasting relationship, and that long-lasting relationship could be bad or it could be good, or it could be neither. So I don't know if you remember those terms, but the only one we talk about is mutualism. Well, talk about right now. And that's when both species benefit. So there's an acacia tree that has acacia ants that live on it. So the tree, in all of these examples, the tree, the plant, is providing the organism a place to live. So you're going to have to tell me an example of mutualism and tell me why they both benefit. Well, first you have to tell me that they both benefit. That's what mutualism is. And then you have to tell me what the relationship is, why they're both benefiting. So in all of these, the plants provide a place to live. In this case, hold on. In this case, the ant provides security to the plant because it attacks anything that's touching the plant, whether that's an insect that touches the plant or even other plants that start to come over and shade the plant, it'll start to eat it. So anything that's touching the plant, it starts to attack. The next one is a fungi, and it lives on the plant roots, and what it does is it just increases the surface area for absorbing water and organic molecules. So sure, it's living on the roots, but all of the water and nutrients that it absorbs can actually go into the plant as well. So it's just increasing the surface area and the amount of water and nutrients getting into the soil. Finally, the last one is a bacteria, that fixes nitrogen for plants. So just like we talked about carbon fixation, this is the same concept, but nitrogen fixation, that just means you're taking it from one place and putting it in another place. So this bacteria is taking nitrogen from the soil and giving it to the plants to build molecules. They live in the nodules of the roots. Some plants have these little nodules, but you don't need to know. If you just say they become established in the roots, that's fine. They fix nitrogen. So, the end, guys. The end. I hope you guys have a great Christmas. And hopefully I'll send you guys a video or something of me and the baby. Or maybe just the baby, because I'll be a hot mess. So, but I hope you guys are doing really well. And again, I miss you. Well, most of you. No, I'm kidding. I miss all of you. And I'll see you in January.